It was a cold night on the streets, the kind that made every breath feel like ice. Marcus, a homeless man who had already seen too many harsh nights, was just trying to keep warm near the back of a diner. He wasn't bothering anyone, just sitting there, wrapped in his worn-out coat, hands trembling from the chill. But then trouble arrived. A police officer, tall and heavy-set, walked up with a look of disgust. "You can't be here," he muttered, gripping a steaming cup of coffee. Marcus barely had time to respond before the officer tilted his hand, letting the scalding liquid spill over Marcus's legs. A sharp cry of pain broke the silence of the alley, but the officer just smirked, as if he'd done something amusing. Then, in the blink of an eye, another figure stepped onto the scene. A man in a dark suit, sharp-eyed and radiating authority. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was calm but firm, the kind that made people freeze. The cop turned, his smirk vanishing, because standing before him wasn't just any man, it was his own brother. And worse, he was an FBI agent. The officer stiffened, his face paling as he met his brother's cold stare. For a moment, the alley was silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing. Steam still rose from his soaked clothes, his hands gripping his burning legs, but his eyes were locked on the man who had just arrived. There was something different about him, controlled, powerful. "Daniel," the cop muttered, his voice tight. "This isn't what it looks like." Daniel didn't flinch. His sharp eyes flicked between Marcus and his brother, taking in everything. The spilled coffee, the pain on Marcus's face, the guilt barely hidden behind the officer's tough stance. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like," Daniel said coolly. Marcus shifted, wincing as he tried to sit up straighter. He had no idea who this new man was, but he knew one thing: cops didn't usually turn on their own. So why was this one different? The officer clenched his jaw. "You don't understand, all right? He shouldn't even be here." Daniel took a slow step forward, "And that gives you the right to hurt him." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something dangerous. The officer swallowed hard. Marcus shifted slightly, his burned skin stinging with every move. He had been through a lot in his life, but this moment felt different, like something bigger was unfolding right in front of him. He watched the two brothers, sensing a deep tension between them that had nothing to do with him. The officer, his badge catching the dim streetlight, crossed his arms. "You don't get it, Daniel. People like him loiter. They cause trouble." Daniel cut him off with a sharp look. "People like him." His voice was dangerously low. He took another step forward, forcing his brother to either stand his ground or back away. "Tell me, do you actually believe what you're saying? Or are you just trying to convince yourself?" The officer's eyes darted to Marcus for a split second before he squared his shoulders. "Look, I was just trying to get him to move along." By pouring hot coffee on him, Daniel's tone was cold, controlled, but Marcus could tell he was furious beneath the surface. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. "Hey man, I don't need trouble on my behalf. Just let it go." But Daniel shook his head. "No, this isn't about just you, Marcus. It's about right and wrong." The officer scoffed. "You don't live in the real world, Daniel. You sit in some office, reading reports, making decisions. Out here, things work differently." Daniel stared at his brother, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, sadness, maybe even regret. "You think this is how it's supposed to be?" Before the officer could answer, a voice echoed from the other end of the alley. "Everything all right here?" All three men turned. A second patrol car had pulled up, and another officer was approaching. The tension thickened instantly. Marcus felt his heart pound. Was this new cop going to make things worse? Or was he about to witness something even more unexpected? The new officer stepped closer, eyes flicking between the three men. His face was unreadable, but his presence alone was enough to shift the air. Marcus could feel it. Something was about to break. Daniel didn't move, standing firm between his brother and Marcus. "That depends," he said, his voice steady. Are you here to help or make this worse? The officer glanced at the cop standing next to him. James, he said, addressing Daniel's brother. What's going on here? James hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly. He looked at Marcus, then at Daniel, as if weighing his next words carefully. Just handling a situation, he muttered. Daniel scoffed. You mean assaulting an unarmed man? The new officer's expression shifted, eyes narrowing. Is that true? James tensed. Look, it's not that simple. Seems pretty simple to me, Daniel shot back. Either you take responsibility, or I make sure someone else does. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. Marcus swallowed hard, sensing the weight of whatever was about to happen. James was sweating now, his jaw clenched tight. Then, without warning, his hand dropped to his belt, just as Daniel moved. Marcus barely had time to react before everything exploded into chaos. James barely had time to grip his belt before Daniel lunged, his hand locking onto his brother's wrist. Don't, Daniel warned, his voice like steel. For a moment, the two brothers stood frozen, eyes locked in a silent battle. Marcus felt his breath catch. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was something deeper, something that had been simmering between them long before tonight. The other officer shifted uneasily. All right, everyone just calm down, he said, but his voice lacked confidence. He was watching James, waiting to see what he'd do next. James yanked his arm away from Daniel, his face red with anger. You always do this, he spat. You think you're better than me? Sitting in your high-rise office, reading case files, while I'm the one dealing with the real world. Daniel didn't flinch. This is what you call dealing with the real world. Hurting people because you can. James opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, a sharp voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Everyone turned. A woman stood at the mouth of the alley, dressed in a sleek suit, her badge glinting under the streetlight. FBI. Marcus exhaled slowly. Whatever was happening tonight wasn't over. It was only getting started. The moment the woman spoke, the tension in the alley shifted. James took a step back, his jaw tightening, but Daniel didn't move. He knew exactly who she was. Agent Carter, he said, his voice calm but firm. She walked toward them with purpose, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Her gaze landed on Marcus, still hunched in pain, then flicked to the spilled coffee on the pavement. She had seen enough. Someone want to explain what's going on here? James cleared his throat, his posture stiff. Just a misunderstanding. Carter raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding. She looked at Marcus again, then at Daniel, who met her gaze without hesitation. James assaulted this man, Daniel said simply. And when I confronted him, he reached for his belt. James's face darkened. I wasn't. Carter held up a hand, cutting him off. Save it. She turned toward the other officer. You witness anything? The officer hesitated, glancing at James. For a second, Marcus thought he'd try to cover for him. But then, with a deep breath, he shook his head. I didn't see it happen, but I heard enough. Carter nodded, then fixed her stare on James. Hand over your badge. James's face went pale. You can't be serious. You crossed a line, she said flatly. And I don't think this is the first time. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. James looked at Daniel, his eyes filled with something unreadable, anger, maybe even betrayal. But Daniel didn't waver. Finally, with shaking hands, James unclipped his badge and set it in Carter's waiting palm. You think you're better than me, he muttered to Daniel. But you're just a guy in a suit. You don't understand what it's like out here. Daniel sighed. Maybe not, but I know right from wrong. James let out a bitter laugh, then turned and walked toward his patrol car. The other officer followed, looking uneasy but saying nothing. As the cars pulled away, Daniel turned back to Marcus. Let's get you some help, he said softly. Marcus nodded, his body still aching, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something unexpected, hope. But just as Daniel helped him to his feet, Carter spoke again. "You should know," she said, her voice calm but serious. "James wasn't acting alone. We've been watching him for months, and if what we suspect is true, this is just the beginning." Daniel's blood ran cold. The night wasn't over. It was only the start of something much bigger. Daniel stared at Carter, his mind racing. "What do you mean he wasn't acting alone?" Carter sighed, slipping James's badge into her pocket. "We've been investigating a group of officers involved in misconduct, abuse of power, covering for each other. James was on our radar, but tonight confirmed everything." Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "Man, I just wanted to stay warm. Didn't think I'd be caught in the middle of all this." Daniel looked at him, guilt flashing across his face. "I'm sorry this happened to you. No one should be treated like that." Marcus gave a tired smile. "You stepped in. That's more than most would do." Carter glanced at Daniel. "We'll need you to make a statement. And Marcus, if you're willing, your testimony could help stop this from happening again." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "If it means no one else goes through this, yeah, I'll do it." Daniel helped Marcus into Carter's car, and as they drove off, he took one last look at the alley. The night had started with cruelty, but it was ending with justice in motion. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing: this was far from over, and he'd be ready.